We are here with Ronald Chapman. We're talking about forgiveness and how we can move past all of this election day anxiety. How would you characterize it? I mean, we've been going through this for the past 18 months now. There's been a lot of vitriol, there's been a lot of rants, there's been a lot of stress and anxiety this election season. I think on both sides of the whole election, but in this space of forgiveness, how do we move forward after the election is over? How do we live with each other after this?
It's going to be tough, isn't it? It's just going to be tough. Well, I suppose, Shan, that the starting point has to be that you're just fed up. I mean, you've had enough. And that's a tough one, because if you've felt injured enough, if you've been devastated by somebody else's perspectives and commentary, whether in person or on social media, it's hard to let go of. But the starting point is really sort of an honest stock taking with oneself, to look at one's own values. And most everybody I know doesn't want to be the kind of person who's hate-filled for the rest of their life, or the kind of person that sets aside relationships with people for long periods of time. They don't want to be the person on their deathbed who says, "Oh man, I wish I'd done it differently." But if we don't have that talking to ourselves, we have an uncanny ability to convince ourselves we could maybe not deal with it, and maybe not today. And then after a succession of days, it becomes increasingly difficult to consider crossing the chasm again. So, got to have a hard talk with yourself about the values of it.
Do you think at the core of it all, it's really that each one of us believes that we're right?
Yeah, well, and yes, and we are just absolutely certain of how wrong they are. And so a piece of this has to be, it's kind of a reframing, honestly, where you look at it and you say, if I were in their shoes, seeing the world the way they're seeing it, it's really a reframing where you realize that based on their circumstances, they just see it a different way, which is it's the beginning point where you can let them a little off the hook to let yourself off the hook. It's so, I don't know, glib to say, well, put yourself in another person's shoes. So I'm not exactly talking about that, but really to give some consideration to where they're coming from, because they believe what they believe, and their experiences are their experience. So it's useful to let them have their reality, even though it doesn't have to be your reality. I guess what that says is, in order for you to be right, they don't have to be wrong. We don't have to live in a dualistic world.
And what is it really that draws us to have that urge to be right, to always be right?
I suppose psychologically it's the ego, right? It's like we like nothing more than to have our reality affirmed, even if we pay a terrible price. It's like, well, okay, it train wrecked my relationship, but I was right. There's a certain satisfaction that comes with that. And some would say that is exactly how the ego works within us, is it is much more interested in having its beliefs and perspectives validated than in anything that might even begin to look like harmony. It points us back once again to a stock taking with ourselves about so what are we really playing out here with people?
Mm-hmm. So how do we go through that? How do we take stock? What's the routine, I guess, the steps? I start here, I go here, and then what?
Well, I'm going to steal from the recovery programs, the 12-step recovery programs, as a starting point. And they start with what they call the 10,000-pound pencil.
10,000-pound pencil.
10,000-pound pencil. Is like you pull out a piece of paper, pull out a journal, pull out a notebook, and you start writing about this grievance, which is why it's the 10,000-pound pencil, because nobody wants to. It's like No, I'd really rather go to my grave certain I was right than actually begin to look at these things, because it's not going to be comfortable. So we begin the writing process, and typically that writing process is to tell the story of what's happened, but then more importantly, to move on to, all right, so what am I bringing to this? And Shannon, it always takes two to tango. There can't be a conflict without someone on either side of the conflict. And so even if you're 10% wrong, 15% wrong, 70% wrong, it's beginning to look at, all right, what is the basis for my offendedness? How is it I've been seemingly injured? And begin to take a good look at that. And then at some point you can switch sides and begin to imagine what it is that they may be experiencing to get a bit of a glimpse. And both of those as you begin to see the story. I mean, the best of all worlds, you can actually get a glimpse into why people are behaving the way they are, and that will awaken some compassion in us.
Okay, so embracing this compassion, it I guess what I'm trying to get at is we have to admit to ourselves that there's a piece of our ego that we need to do away with.
Well, honestly, Shan, most of us arrive at this because we're suffering. Most of us don't come to this conversation because we're virtuous. We believe in forgiveness, we believe in harmony, we believe in peace on earth, all those things. But when it comes down to it, we really believe in being right more than that. And the classic story you hear is the suffering factor goes up so much. I mean, people start paying a terrible price. And with that terrible price, they begin to realize they're going to need to do something differently. And so we arrive at it with this certainty that we have to do something differently, else never get out from under, which is it's a steep price.
Right, so we just keep cycling and looping back and forth, and we
Yeah.
never break free of it.
Yeah, since I do a lot of this work professionally in all kinds of ways, and one of the ones that always sticks home is invariably with these kinds of things, if you start talking about monetary things in families, almost everybody will say, oh yeah, well there is my Aunt Lottie who has not talked to my Uncle Bob for 37 years because they got all hacked off at each other at a drunken family picnic, 4 decades ago, and they've never, ever spoken again.
Or Thanksgiving.
Yeah, Thanksgiving. Maybe not drunken, but Thanksgiving. And and we look at that, and the crazy thing is we see that and we go, oh, but I'm not like that. So I would never do that. But the launching off part for that is exactly what's happening in this political space right now, is people are going down that path. And some of those things, if we don't bridge them now, they're not probably ever going to be bridged. It won't get better, it'll only get worse as time mounts up.
So how do we break free of that pull? I mean, I go on to social media and, I'm looking for things like, maybe the Cubs will win this World Series. I'm rooting for them, I'm really pulling for them. But every other post seems to be about this election, about what he said or what she did or mismanaged, and how do we keep ourselves from getting pulled down that path?
Well, I do know a fair number of people who are just staying away from it, right? They're just avoiding it, but it's still aggravating them. I mean, I hear this all the time about people who are being dragged along against their will, and in some cases against their knowledge. They're just resentful and don't seem to be able to know why. The thing I have done mostly, I have a couple of strategies. The thing I look for is an opportunity to intervene in something. Now, in order to intervene effectively, to not just perpetuate the violence that's going on, the vitriol, the only way to do that is you've got to find an entree that breaks the cycle. So you can't just go in and say, well, you're an idiot, and if you were here, I'd punch you in the nose. I mean, you're just, on and on we'll go. I'm thinking now about a story. I was in a schoolyard. This is some years ago, and an older boy who was a little taller than a younger boy was bullying this kid. And at some point, the little kid turned to him, and he looked him in the eye and he said, You hurt my soul. Yeah, I saw the look on your face. It stopped it, right? I mean, the little kid didn't try and bully the bully back, didn't run from him. He used an approach point that shifted the conversation in an instant. And that's the kind of interventions we have the possibility of doing. The other one is the one that takes a deep breath, which is to say to someone, hey, can we talk? Right? Not, I'm right, you're wrong, I want to talk to you. Right? It's like,
Right.
Hey, can we talk? It could be an apology, it's not necessary. But it takes a fair amount of courage to even step into that space. And we've got to be convinced that we don't want to live our life in resentment and grievance for the rest of our life. And people are going to listen and go, oh, it won't be the rest of my life. Well, yeah, talk to your Aunt Lottie and Uncle Bob about how they got 37 years down the pike. And by the way, I have one of those in my family system as well, where it's been 3 decades. And the grievance runs too deep after 30 years.
So it's got to be one party that says, you know what, I'm going to step into this willingly and engage these emotions and whatever the obstacles are. And let's see if we can take the volume down and work through it like civilized people.
Right.
I think we all believe at some level that we're civilized, right?
Well, we certainly would like to believe that, yeah. The behavior doesn't seem to substantiate it on occasion, but yeah, someone's got to lean into it and say, okay, let's see if we can't turn this. Now, if I was really going to go real values-based on people, what I would talk about is how those ripple effects, they do affect other people. We used to tell the story in quality improvement trainings about how big boss would yell, little boss would yell at the line supervisor would yell at the worker would go home, kick the dog would bite the cat would pee on the pillow. I mean, that really does, okay, so maybe not exactly that, but that's what happens, is this stuff just ripples out. We can see it in traffic, we can see it in the workplace quite often, certainly in family systems. And so if I was really wanting to confront people about the reality, it's like you can't not act this stuff out. It will find its way out of you. And the result of that will be unpleasant for somebody else and could be pretty tragic, in fact. There are lots of occasions where it just goes really badly for someone. And we need to stop lying to ourselves about how, well, I can just keep that isolated over there and not do any character assassination or not let the annoyance and frustration show through to somebody else. We just need to stop lying. It does affect others. And because of what you said, that most of us are people of goodwill, when we start telling the truth to ourselves, the goodwill oftentimes will begin to win the day because we just can't. It's like that thing, you're laying in bed at night and there's something you got to make right, and you just can't. You just can't go to sleep because you just got to make it right. And that's what happens when you begin telling the truth about this stuff, is you come face to face with yourself.
Is there an easy button for that? It sounds pretty difficult.
Yeah, the 3 easy steps to not have problems anywhere in your relationships, right? No, but what does happen with time is you get a lot more comfortable with leaning into it, with apology, with approach. I think what happens, honestly, Shan, is you get comfortable enough with your own discomfort that it's sort of like, it's uncomfortable, what's the big deal? I'd like to get this deal made right. And we just kind of push right on past it. Not unlike, I know you've been in gyms before, as most of us have. That first time in the gym, it's tough getting up enough wherewithal to push through the pain, as they would say.
It is.
But after you've done it, 5-6 days a week for, 6, 7, 8 months, it's just not a problem. It's just not a problem. And presumably the pain is still just as significant in terms of how it's affecting the body, but you've built up your spiritual or psychological muscle, and so the result is it's just not a big deal.
Kind of like living with physical pain from an injury.
Yeah.
Your body adjusts to that. And so are you saying that it works the same way with emotional injury?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I was just thinking about this the other day. I just recently did a workshop on forgiveness, and I was just thinking about how at one point in time it was just almost impossible for me to admit I was wrong and to step into it. And what I was comparing was, so this was a couple decades ago or more, is my ability now to very quickly, especially where clients are concerned, because it's so much easier there, right? I mean, you
Right.
really need to you need to bring the goodwill unless something really, really wrong is happening. And it's like, okay, all right, I screwed up. What do I need to do to make this right? And some people say, well, what if it wasn't me who screwed up? Like, well, would you like to heal the relationship, or do you want to be right? There is an appropriate place for a concession if it's appropriate. And in some cases, that's not the best strategy. I was just recently encountered someone who used a racial epithet, just out of the blue. And I had to make a decision on the spot whether or not do you say something. And in that particular instance, I decided it just wasn't worth. It just wasn't a good time. And so I had to take a deep breath and let it go, because me carrying that around is not going to do anybody any good. But I remember it, and at some point with this person, I may have an opportunity to say something. But for now, it's one incident, and so it'd be different if it happened all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like they talk a lot about building they really do in many settings, talk about building your spiritual muscles, right? By simply doing these things. And it's as good a description as any.
So we've gotten to the part where we say to ourselves, I'm hurt, and I don't want to feel this way anymore, and I need to do something about it. So we start that whole engagement process, right?
Yes, that's the
And
beginning.
we start running into that wall and bouncing off of it. How do we get through that? I mean, do we go over the wall? Do we go under the wall, around it, through it? How do we move past that engagement part?
Well, the craziest thing is that what I like to call releasing, which is sort of a higher game than forgiving. I mean, it's the letting go of. Releasing has a habit of happening just by beginning to engage. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're stewing on something with your wife, your family, somebody, and as soon as you engage by opening your mouth and say, hell, something as innocuous as "can we talk?"
Mm-hmm.
Or when you say, my feelings are kind of hurt, or we need to work this out. Any of those things, the most amazing thing is just by engaging, we start something into motion that oftentimes brings with it resolution, because a lot of the grievance is actually what's wound up inside us. It's like many, many times what the original offense was, because our brain replays it over and over again. Because that's what we do. It's like, one of my mentors said, it's like, when you get that little chip in your tooth,
Mm-hmm.
you just can't, you just can't leave it, and it feels so big. And you realize that you're just wearing yourself out with your tongue because you just can't leave it alone. It's like that.
And then your tongue is raw, and it feels even larger every time you touch it.
Yeah, and then the dentist looks at it and goes, "Oh, yeah, let me just buff it out." And it's like, wow, I thought it was such a big deal. And admittedly, sometimes it is, but the multiplying effect of us worrying it to death is oftentimes much, much greater than the actual offense. Nothing like replaying an offense, I don't know, 300, 400 times to get it to be far more significant. It's kind of like the fish story, right?
Right.
It's like the fish was like, yeah.
The fish story has compound interest.
Yeah.
It just keeps getting larger and larger over time.
The surprising part about the engagement, though, that I've watched over the years, I do some specific work around conflict mediation, and so the thing that has been amazing to me is the number of times that the person on the other side is surprised or comparably willing. It's not at all unusual for someone to go, oh, I had no idea. I didn't know I had offended you. But we will never find that out. Because I hear a lot of stories about people who just vanish from people's lives. Something happened and it's 10 years later. It's like, I don't know what happened. They just vanished. There was never even a chance to work it out. So there's a whole lot of misperception, misunderstanding. And of course, to be honest, with social media or email, it's awfully easy to not have appropriate affect in the words we use, and for someone to completely miss it. It's happened to me many, many, many times. Which is why they tell you, like, don't hit the send button. Just don't do it. right?
That's true. That's very true.
Back off, breathe, take a walk, talk to somebody about it, and then consider how you want to respond. Or better still, and I just did this, just did this today. I had fired off a note to a client and got a fairly lengthy response where I had managed to throw her into a fear loop about what I was proposing. And I realized I had not been effective at all with what I communicated. So my first response is, oh, I'll hammer out a reply. And I thought, no, that's a bad idea. You need to pick up the phone and leave a message if you can't get her. Because it was very apparent to me that there was a misunderstanding. I own it. I didn't communicate adequately because I was just firing off a little bit of information. And hopefully she'll call me back. Hopefully. I don't know. We'll find out what happens. But just hammering off a social media post or firing off an email sometimes is absolutely a colossally bad idea because you just perpetuate the misunderstanding. Even with emoticons, smiley face, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just not, sometimes it just doesn't work very well.
I find myself leaving a lot of comments unposted.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see what's being discussed, and I want to respond.
Yeah.
And I want to respond with all of my best knowledge and research and links and things like that. But I find it's a better policy to write it and just delete it.
Well, actually, see, there's a really good strategy. Is they talk a lot about psychologists will talk a lot about just burn it out, right? Write that letter that get the feelings out. Because there's something cathartic. Or save it. What's on your mind. Better to delete it. Sometimes 3 a.m. comes around and your fingers hovering over the send button, right?
Yes.
And it's like, don't do it, don't do it. Oh, damn. So, but there is catharsis, and in a lot of healing practices, people write things down and then they burn it, right? The symbolic letting go, which can help. A lot of it just depends on our commitment to our own healing and our own, success in our own lives versus that just gotta be right. Just gotta be right.
You mentioned something earlier about social media.
Yeah.
And how it's become more difficult to move past some of these old injuries because I was reading an article where they mentioned that the internet has made it harder to forget things.
That's right. It's like, don't you remember on December 4th when you said bang, 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 bang? Yeah.
And thanks to Facebook's feature where they remind you of, sometimes they're not the best memories.
Right. Yeah.
But how do we survive emotionally and thrive really in a world where it's becoming increasingly more difficult to forget things that happen?
Yeah. Well, here's a really interesting experience I've had. I will periodically have one of those come back round, and I have been known now to laugh at them because, if we clean them up, if we release them, or if we get done with it, if we let them go, oftentimes looking back at them is either humorous or, honestly, every now and then you'll get one you'll go like, what was that about? I mean, literally, it's gone. We have forgotten it. And there's that wisdom that comes from some teachers, philosophical teachers, who will say, like at this moment, Shenandoah, what were you worried about last year at this time?
What month is this?
Right, see, it's like, I mean, really, because there's that instantaneous, I mean, what's right before us, right at this moment, we feel like is so dramatic and significant, and oftentimes by X number of days later, it just pales. It wasn't that big a deal, but that's probably why electronic media is so challenging. Is because you get it, and I mean, it would have been different back in the days when your letter had to go by stagecoach, right?
Right.
I mean, you had a lot of time to think about what you had written or what they had written before the next cycle came around. And I suspect that deliberative time was a very beneficial thing.
Absolutely. Plus, you had the option of burning it later.
Yeah, well, maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need a series of send buttons. Send urgent, send, give me about 30 seconds to think about this. Send tomorrow, but remind me before you send it, right?
That's actually not a bad idea.
That's right. So I can see it popping up. It's like, do you really want to send this? Oh, yeah, that was a really bad idea. Delete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now that we've thought about what we're going to say, how we're going to say it, we've started leaning into it, right? Mm-hmm. And we're getting into this really deep place.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think of it like you start up here, and when you start engaging with it, it starts taking you down this rabbit hole, right? Mm-hmm. And then you get somewhere down here towards the bottom. It's a little bit darker. There's not a whole lot of light. There might be some scarier fish down here. And how do we come back up? How do we come back up from that releasing point and just float back to the surface?
Sure. Yeah, I've never thought of it this way. So this is really great. When it really gets released, there's a natural buoyancy. It really, I know you and others have had this experience where you finally say something the way it needs to be said, or you finally, that moment where it's like, oh. Sometimes it comes because of the interaction with another. It's not uncommon when doing conflict work between intimate partners for what to come out is for someone to be surprised because they have not a clue that was what was going on with their partner. Mm-hmm. So sometimes that's the buoyancy where one partner will say, well, Shan, blah, 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 and you go, oh, I had no idea. In fact, I was doing this work with a guy, almost 70, professional who's almost 70, and it was teaching him some tools. I mean, the fact that he was still an active learner impressed me. He was still professionally employed, and I got a note from him about a week later. He said, I went home and I tried a couple things with my wife. We've been married for 40 however many years. And he says, Ron, we ended up talking about something that we never knew about each other in our 40 plus years together because we'd never broached the subject.
Wow.
Yeah, okay, so it's an anecdote of one, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit, but that kind of stuff happens where suddenly you realize that this thing that has been taking up space in your life is it's just not true, or it's not sufficiently informed. Because there's lots of things we don't want to talk about because they're uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to take you down into a place that has a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And like I said before, a lot of scary fish live down there.
Yeah.
And it can feel a little suffocating at times.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a little more graphic. I mean, I actually love the portrait of buoyancy, but there's another one. I know you're a cat guy, so you'll appreciate this one. It's been referred to as coughing up an emotional hairball. Right?
Yes.
I mean, it's really graphic. But I mean, you've watched a cat, they hack, and it's really awful. And then, the hairball's out, and it's kind of like, okay, where's the food dish, right? I mean, I'm ready to go groom myself or something. I mean, there's that cathartic experience of getting done with something that has, a natural buoyancy, a natural return to balance. There's a great, I don't know, it's a short film, a short clip. What do they call those? Video shorts. There's a video short that I saw about a year ago, where they showed some kind of a plains animal, savanna animal in Africa, being chased by a lion and getting away. And once the animal, wish I could remember, an impala, something, that just managed to barely get away. And they showed the animal, after they were a safe distance away, stopping and just shaking. And they said, well, that's the discharge, right? Because this difficult situation produced all this swamp of hormones and all that, because it was near death. And what the animal will do is stop and just shake it out, release it all. And then they showed the animal going off and grazing. And I remember thinking, it's like, that's probably that kind of an idea of just shaking it out of us, doing something to release it physically, and the chemicals and everything, particularly if it's traumatic. Allows us to return to a state of equilibrium more readily.
And so once we've gotten there to that state of equilibrium, how do we maintain that? Or is it something that's just ephemeral? Do we maintain it, or do we move on to the next thing and just keep living our lives?
I'm of the opinion that we don't stay anywhere. That we're constantly, the best visual for this is imagine yourself on a high wire or a low wire, either way, right? And the wind's blowing and trees are, everything's going on, and you're constantly rebalancing, right?
Right.
And every now and then you'll teeter way off to the edge, and you have to do something extreme to get back. So, I look at this as kind of a dynamic, emotional, harmonizing practice or something like that, where we just keep. Because all day, every day, we're being exposed to things that will knock us off balance, offend us, hurt us, injure us, all those sorts of things. And there's a guy named Stephen Levine who says that what we do is we learn how to attend to it on a continuing basis, so that it doesn't, his language was, so that it doesn't, callous the heart, harden the heart, and callous the soul. All these little grievances, which he would have said were the explanation for why we run into some of those proverbial crotchety old people who've got all this unfinished business, and which I guess is yet one more reason to take this seriously. None of us wants to be a crotchety old miserable person, but there is some reason to believe that that's a whole bunch of unresolved injuries built up over time. And some of which you can probably not do much about. The aging process is not a kind process necessarily, but maybe we should be more like those savanna animals, shaking that stuff off every time we have the opportunity, so that we can be returned to a better state of equilibrium.
So, how does this impact our lives in a positive manner? What is really the benefit of going through this whole process of forgiveness, professionally, personally, in our own lives, in our professional lives?
Sure. Well, let's just go real practical first. There is so much evidence growing about the price we pay for stress, just cumulative stress, in all the little ways, that it affects everything from our cardiovascular health, our mental health. Many of us have addictions, compulsive eating, forms of behavior which don't serve us well, which are all adaptive because we're stuck with stuff. So if we just look purely at the level of physical health, you see some immediate. The data's really strong on this. If we look at it from an emotional or psychological point of view, just all you have to do is look around at the evidence, usually for older people. And I still remember an older couple who clearly had a good forgiveness practice over their lifetime. And they were wonderful. They were both in their late 80s at the time I knew them. And they were just bright and engaging, and it was obvious that the blows of life had not added up upon them. They had clearly, so there's this emotional, psychological health. I use the example of how none of us wants to be a crotchety, miserable old person. So there's that piece. If we take it into the spiritual space, which most everybody who will listen at least has some humanistic values, if not some religious ones, boy, the messages in all of those are, Jesus, forgive 70 times 7, right? Psychology, don't ever go to bed mad at your partner. Let it go, figure out how to work it out. Don't do it. The Buddha spent much of his time talking about the nature of attachment, and deep attachment is grievance, right? We're attached to the grievance.
Right.
So you go down this list. I mean, the ancient Jewish tradition is filled with practices intended to let go of things. I guess you could make an argument that says that we used to be a much more communally oriented species, and that stuff would cause people to hurt each other badly, up to and including murder. And so it was not good for the species to have that stuff pent up. When you look at the anecdotal evidence in your own life, if you're honest with yourself, it becomes very quickly apparent that unfinished business that you have with people is dragging you down in all kinds of ways. And so pretty much across the board, there's like all these apparent benefits, and yet still, right? It's like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to make this. I'm pretty sure I want to hate that person, right?
Yes.
Because somehow or another we convince ourselves that we can avoid the price, but the evidence is pretty strong that we can't avoid the price.
And it's so much more than just saying, I forgive you
publicly,
yes. But still holding it privately.
Yeah, that's actually you talk a lot about passive aggressive behavior. Well, someone will say, well, that's okay. But then, 3 minutes later, they make a snarky comment. It is not. We're not done with this. It happens in primary relationships. Oh, it's okay, honey, right? And then they cold shoulder you. They're like, okay, it is not. And probably the greater price when you look at this in terms of our primary relationships is that effect over time, right? Where all those unvoiced grievances presumably would lead to breakdowns in the relationships in their lives. So I'd say the evidence is pretty compelling. And probably the reason to look at it that way, Shan, is because nobody will disagree with the virtues of forgiving and love and harmony. And go any place, say, what do you think? What do you think about peace and harmony? Everybody say, yeah, we want peace and harmony. You willing to give up your grievances for it? Well, let's don't get rash here, right?
Sounds a little extreme.
Yeah, that's right. I'm pretty sure I'd rather have those sons of bitches admit they're wrong, and then maybe I'll consider letting them off the hook. And we haven't really talked about the one piece, which is when we start looking at trauma, right, which is literally held in the body. Right? I mean, it is what they used to call shell shock, for example. But trauma is not just war. I mean, it's a bad car accident. It's even what they call high-frequency, low-intensity trauma, where you're told you're stupid 10,000 times by the time you're 15 years old. And you know what? I mean, it has an effect, a lifetime effect. And so that stuff seems to be literally held in the body. That it's not just cognitive. If you talk to people who've survived something violent, this is a classic with rape victims who've literally disassociated, which means they are out of body, right? Mm-hmm. It's too painful to be with. And while some manage to work their way through that, there are plenty that, their relationality with men, presuming the rape victim is a female, is compromised for lifetimes, because they can't release it. That's a steep price too. So there's all these indicators, and still it's well, yeah, but not me. I got this. It'll be fine. when in fact the evidence suggests that's not true. But we have a remarkable capacity for self-delusion.
We really do.
Yeah, yeah.
How do we get a jump on this earlier? You know, you're talking about these older people that have these remarkable lives because they haven't let these old injuries weather them. But you know, we have a whole very large generation that is growing up in this world that, you know, some of the earliest memories were these deep traumas that affected us on a national and international level,
Sure.
and continue today. And you know, it's created a lot of fear and stress. How do we start now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and let's just acknowledge, if you're in some place like, I don't know, pick a place, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, I mean, that's a pretty awful place. I mean, I'm sure it's a beautiful place, but the cycle of violence is just awful. You know, you can make a pretty interesting argument that that cycle of violence is reinforced by generational violence, that, you know, and those people don't put down their guns and they don't put down their grievances, right? They chase people for lifetimes to kill them. But the trauma on the children is, you know, there it is.
Well, I think we could say the same thing about a lot of parts of the United States as well.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's a body of work called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, I forget the S. Anyway, the data is extraordinarily strong about just growing up in average poverty, average hunger, average violence. Greatly decreases the likelihood of success in your life. And so you know, if you look at this through Maslow's hierarchy, Maslow basically proposed that, you know, to the degree that you could get safety and security taken care of, you can move up the scale of functioning and realization.
Right.
Well, if you're constantly battling, right, I mean, you won't be doing any self-realization. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to get to if you're fighting every day just to stay alive. So there's a number of ways to respond to this. One is, for the more significant stuff, there's a lot of work being done now on people who interface directly with children to recognize and treat trauma on the fly as soon as they see it. First responders, teachers, etc. So that's great. There's a great practice called breath work. I actually have an audio set for that. Breathing, releasing, and breaking through. Imagine that. Where you can use the breath in the same way that it's almost like, as I see it, it's almost like that animal I was talking about that shakes it off. I mean, you literally use the breath. And with practice, you get better and better at registering the stuff. For me, I've been practicing many years now, and there are often times that I can feel the injury in my body, not physical injury, psychic injury. I can feel it before I can name it now. And I stop and I breathe. And just attending to it, to use Stephen Levine's language, can be very, very beneficial. Some people use, you know, things like running. I mean, right? I mean,
right.
That's like, let's go burn this thing out of our system. And so there's all kinds of strategies. In the best of all worlds, we come up with some kind of a practice, mindfulness, breath work. I even know a guy who uses his Tai Chi practice throughout the course of the day, right, to work through stuff. There seems to be great value in having some kind of a practice. I mean, people use prayer practice, right? I mean, they do all kinds of things. And what seems to be the optimal, since we're not any of us, okay, if you're on the web, you're going to pick up some debris. You're just going to, right? If you're walking the earth, if you're driving the streets of Atlanta, you're going to have some experiences. So you can't eliminate the experiences. And in the best of all worlds, prevention is always better if we can find a way. And so in the best of all worlds, everything we can do to catch it as it rises, to catch it when it happens, to deal with it, to process it, to get done with it. That is kind of the best of all worlds, especially because when we deal with it when it shows up, just like that gazelle or whatever it was, shook it off and went right back to grazing. It's like, okay, I'm good, ready to roll, ready to function. So that's kind of the optimal we're aiming for. Unfortunately, when you look at the generational effects on children, it's hard not to have your heart break open when you realize that there's so much being done that are putting real constraints on children's development because they're being affected by these things and we don't deal with them. And then we become adults with all this history of unfinished stuff, and then someone posts some snarky comment, and the next thing you know, we're ready to hit someone.
Just engaged again.
Yeah. No, I suppose one could say it could become a full-time practice if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. And my personal preference is, here it is. Here's my rubber hitting the road. Is I am so pleased that most of the crap that used to blow up on me, I can now catch. And much less frequently do I have to clean up some behavior with someone. The prevention really, I always hated having to own my failings. And the ability to manage that stuff within me before the failings get expressed is a great gift. Lot less pain and suffering in my life as a result.
Well, it sounds like you've developed and mastered a pretty good system for getting yourself to that buoyancy, that state where you can shake it off.
Yeah. And just in the interest of being really honest. And of course, being human means you're going to screw things up.
Well, of course.
It's like, so all the more reason to have an active dynamic practice that keeps cleaning this stuff up because the price of not cleaning it up is too high.
Absolutely. So let's fast forward.
Okay.
To
when we achieve nirvana, peace on earth, goodwill to all men and women.
Let's fast forward to 12:01 Eastern Standard Time on November 9th.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to be on one side of this thing.
Yeah.
How do you not go to bed in a state of despair or minimize that?
Yeah. Just in keeping what we've talked about, I've been actually processing this stuff for weeks now. Sometime back, I began to see how it was affecting me, and I realized that I'm a bit of a news junkie, and I have to admit, sometimes you see that news item roll across, and you go, oh, what now, right? And you just can't leave it alone. So I'm not perfect about that, but I've been working my way through this stuff, for weeks. And one of my longtime mentors said that if you do the work in an anticipatory fashion, it's not going to be a problem when it actually comes. So hopefully you've been doing anticipatory work if you're listening to this. If you haven't, depending upon your perspective, I'd start in immediately trying to figure out how to process that, get it done, put it in your past. It'll be challenging, particularly if the person who won is offensive to you. But if you don't, let's be honest. If you look at the political environment right now, it's so obvious people aren't letting things go.
Right.
Right? So much of the vitriol in this whole election has been stuff that happened decades ago. Right? Where something, and granted, some of it's very problematic. I don't want to minimize it. But the fact that what's starting so much of this vitriol up is something floated up from the ancient past, relatively speaking. You begin to see just how deeply this stuff is held on to. And then it begins to justify really some inappropriate, there are things that people are doing that if you ask them to contrast it with their value set, they'd be deeply ashamed that they're acting the way they are. But it dates back to 2-3 decades ago, in some cases even further. So it's never too late to start. If I were going to give the best advice I could give to someone, pick one of those broken relationships, one of the ones that you're wounded about, and take a deep breath and approach that person and say, okay, it's done. Can we talk? And see what happens. Because if it goes very long, you're not ever going to talk to them again, and that means the healing will. Oftentimes what we run into is people who are trying to let go of things that it's complicated by the fact that the person they're trying to get done with is dead. That's really difficult work, as anyone who's practiced it knows. So start now, pick one that's just enough of a stretch to really boost your practice, your forgiveness practice. But don't pick one that's so unforgivable that you're going to have to kill them or kill yourself. Be reasonable, but do something to begin to reverse it, because the price is very, very high. And if not, if not for your own personal well-being and the well-being of your family, do it, because we're going to have to repair the fabric of this culture that we're all living in, and it's going to be a bit of a climb.
Absolutely. Well, going forward, obviously we have a lot of work to do on ourselves, in the interest of others, especially with Thanksgiving just around the corner, followed by Christmas.
Right?
This seems to be a great time of year to start the whole forgiveness practice before the new year starts.
Yeah. You get that great visual, right? It's like we're going to try and sit around the table, in some cases with people that we have had bitter words with, and we're going to pretend like we all are so loving and harmonious. And then someone will drink a little bit too much eggnog or something, and you know what's going to happen, right? Somebody's going to say,
"Thanks, Obama,"
and it's like, and off it will go, and it will probably ruin many a Thanksgiving day, and many days thereafter. It's probably, so there you go. See, it's perfect. So November 9th, I think Thanksgiving is on the 25th.
So
it's like 16 days to do your forgiveness practice, so you don't have to hurt someone at Thanksgiving dinner.
We can all hope.
Well, it's probably worth trying.
It's been a pleasure, Ron. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Shan. Appreciate it very much. Good conversation.